Here's a number that should stop you mid-sip of your morning coffee. Nationally representative nutrition surveys show that in adults over 75, average magnesium intake sits at only about 63 to 75% of the estimated average requirement, depending on sex. That's not a rare edge case. That's the average, meaning roughly half of people in that age bracket are eating even less than that. Zoom out further, and a large cross-national analysis estimates that close to 2.4 billion people worldwide, about 31% of the entire global population, fail to meet recommended magnesium intake levels. In the United States specifically, data drawn from national health surveys puts the figure even higher. Nearly half of all adults consume less magnesium than the estimated average requirement. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. This isn't only a what you eat problem. After 60, it becomes a what your body does with what you eat problem. Intestinal absorption of magnesium declines with age, kidney handling becomes less efficient at conserving it, and several extremely common medications quietly increase how much magnesium gets flushed out. One hospital-based study of elderly patients found that 29% had confirmed hypomagnesemia, low blood magnesium. And among patients aged 81 and above, that number jumped to 53.1%. In other words, in that oldest group, magnesium deficiency wasn't the exception. It was closer to a coin flip. This matters because magnesium isn't a minor mineral sitting quietly in the background. It's a required cofactor in over 300 enzymatic reactions. Muscle contraction, nerve signaling, blood sugar regulation, blood pressure control, bone mineral structure, and energy production all depend on it. Research published using data from the Seniors Enrica cohort links low magnesium intake in older adults to a measurably higher risk of frailty, the medical term for the gradual loss of strength, stamina, and resilience that makes daily tasks harder. A separate study on hospitalized older adults found that low magnesium status was independently associated with lower cognitive test scores, even after adjusting for age, body mass index, and chronic disease. So the mineral matters. The question this countdown answers is different from the usual eat more spinach advice you've already heard. It's this: what specific things are people over 60 doing at breakfast, often believing they're being healthy, that are actively working against their magnesium status? We're counting down from 7 to 1. Bold headings, hard numbers, and for every mistake, the research-backed fix, including the timing that actually makes a difference. A quick note on the actual target. The recommended dietary allowance for magnesium in adults is roughly 420 mg per day for men and 320 mg per day for women. And that number does not drop as you age, even though absorption efficiency does. That mismatch is the entire problem in one sentence. The requirement stays the same while the body's ability to extract and hold onto magnesium declines. A Canadian National Health Survey found inadequate magnesium intake in more than 45% of sampled adults, with the rate consistently higher among older adults and women. None of this is exotic data from a fringe study. This is mainstream, government-level nutrition surveillance repeating the same finding across different countries. Mistake number 7. Drinking coffee or tea before eating anything. Black coffee on an empty stomach feels virtuous. 0 calories, no sugar, no guilt. But from a mineral balance standpoint, caffeine consumed before food is one of the most measurable, and most overlooked, magnesium drains in a typical morning routine. The research, controlled studies on caffeine's effect on kidney handling of minerals are strikingly consistent. In one well-cited experiment, an average caffeine dose caused urinary magnesium excretion to jump by 45%, alongside a 78% increase in calcium excretion and a 74% increase in sodium excretion, all within about 2 hours. A separate renal physiology study found that caffeine intake reduced the kidney's percent reabsorption of magnesium from 97% down to 94.2%, meaning a larger share of the magnesium filtered by the kidneys simply passes into urine instead of being reclaimed. Over a full day, this translates to a net additional urinary loss of roughly 0.16 mole of magnesium per caffeine exposure. Small per cup, but compounding with every daily coffee habit, and worse on an empty stomach, when gastric emptying and mineral handling shift in ways that amplify the diuretic effect. For someone over 60 who is already absorbing magnesium less efficiently, adding a caffeine-driven excretion spike before any dietary magnesium has even entered the system is a stacked disadvantage. Losses before you've made any gains. The right way and right timing. Eat first, then drink coffee or tea, ideally with at least 20 to 30 minutes of separation, or consumed alongside a magnesium-containing food rather than on its own. This doesn't mean eliminating coffee. It means sequencing it so caffeine isn't hitting an empty system and isn't the very first thing metabolized each day. Limiting intake to 1 to 2 cups, rather than multiple cups back-to-back in the first hour of waking, also meaningfully reduces the cumulative excretion effect documented in these studies. There's a secondary detail worth noting. Researchers who study this effect point out that no adaptation occurs with continued daily caffeine use, meaning long-term coffee drinkers don't develop a tolerance that protects them from this excretion effect. The kidneys respond to today's cup of coffee the same way they responded to a cup consumed a decade ago. That's why sequencing, not quitting, is the sustainable fix. The goal is to stop the mineral loss from happening on an empty, unprotected system every single morning. Mistake number 6. Pairing a big dose of calcium with your main magnesium source at the same meal. This is the one that surprises most people because calcium and magnesium together sounds like a health headline, not a mistake. Multivitamin ads and fortified milk marketing have trained everyone to think of these two minerals as a package deal. The research: calcium and magnesium share the same intestinal transport pathways for absorption. When one is present in a large dose, it competes with the other for the same absorption doorway. This is why clinical guidance on magnesium supplementation consistently recommends spacing high-dose calcium intake away from magnesium-rich meals or supplements. The two are not synergistic in large simultaneous doses. They're rivals at the point of absorption. This competitive relationship is well documented in mineral balance research, and it's precisely why a breakfast built around a large glass of milk, a calcium-fortified juice, and a calcium supplement all consumed in the same 10 minutes can blunt magnesium uptake from anything else on the plate. Oats, nuts, or seeds included. For adults over 60 who are frequently advised by doctors to increase calcium for bone density, this creates an unintentional trap. The very meal built to protect bones can be structured in a way that undercuts magnesium, a mineral that is also essential for bone mineral structure and for activating vitamin D into its usable form. The right way and right timing. If a calcium supplement is part of the morning routine, take it at a different meal than the main magnesium-rich foods. For example, calcium at breakfast and magnesium-rich foods, leafy greens, nuts, seeds, legumes, at lunch or dinner, or with at least a 2-hour gap between them. If both need to happen at breakfast for practical reasons, keep the calcium dose moderate rather than maximal, and don't stack a calcium supplement on top of an already calcium-heavy food combination. It's also worth noting that the ideal dietary calcium to magnesium ratio discussed in mineral balance research sits roughly between 1 to 1 and 2 to 1, far tighter than the ratio in a typical Western breakfast, where a large glass of fortified milk plus a calcium supplement can push that ratio to 4 to 1 or higher before lunch even arrives. Rebalancing that ratio rather than removing calcium altogether is the actual research-supported target. Bone health and magnesium status are not competing goals. They only compete when both are maximized in the exact same 15-minute window. Mistake number 5. Building breakfast around refined carbohydrates, even whole grain marketed ones. White toast, many packaged cereals, pastries, and even a lot of products labeled multigrain undergo processing that strips out the bran and germ, the exact parts of the grain where magnesium is concentrated. The research: refining wheat into white flour removes up to 80% of the grain's original magnesium content, according to milling and nutrient retention data widely cited in nutrition science. On top of the raw nutrient loss, refined carbohydrates cause a faster, sharper rise in blood glucose and insulin. Elevated blood glucose increases renal magnesium excretion. The kidneys lose more magnesium into urine when glucose filtration is elevated, a mechanism well established in research linking poor glycemic control to magnesium depletion. This creates a double penalty: less magnesium going in from the food itself, and more magnesium being pushed out due to the glycemic spike the food causes. This mechanism is especially relevant after 60 because insulin sensitivity naturally declines with age, meaning the same refined carb breakfast produces a larger glucose spike, and a larger magnesium loss, than it would have decades earlier. The right way and right timing. Choose intact or minimally processed grains, steel-cut oats, whole barley, or products where the bran is still present, over flaked, puffed, or instant versions. Pairing any carbohydrate with protein or a small amount of fat at breakfast, rather than eating carbs alone, blunts the glucose spike and, by extension, reduces the magnesium excretion penalty. Timing-wise, front-loading protein or fiber before the carbohydrate portion of the meal, even eating vegetables or eggs first, carbs last, has been shown in glucose response research to flatten the glycemic curve meaningfully. Reading labels matters more at this age than at any earlier one, because marketing language like made with whole grain is legally permitted even when whole grain is a minority ingredient blended with refined flour. The research-backed check is simple. Look for a whole grain listed as the first ingredient, not just present somewhere in the list, and check fiber content directly. A genuinely intact grain product typically carries 3 grams of fiber or more per serving, while heavily refined products marketed similarly often carry a fraction of that. Mistake number 4. Eating oat bran or bran cereal without any preparation. This one sits right next to the previous mistake but deserves its own spot because it trips up exactly the people trying hardest to eat healthy. Bran is genuinely magnesium-rich, but it also contains phytic acid, a compound that binds to magnesium and other minerals in the gut and can reduce how much is actually absorbed rather than just passed through. The research: phytic acid is concentrated in the outer layers of grains and legumes, the same layers that make bran nutrient-dense in the first place. Studies on mineral bioavailability show that untreated high-phytate foods can reduce magnesium absorption efficiency, because phytate forms a complex with magnesium that the gut cannot break down and absorb. This doesn't mean bran is bad, it means eating it in its rawest, least prepared form. Dry bran sprinkled on top of cereal, for instance, delivers less usable magnesium than the label's nutrient panel suggests, because that panel reflects total mineral content, not absorbable mineral content. The right way and right timing: soaking oats or bran overnight, or choosing naturally fermented preparations, like traditional sourdough over quick rise bread, reduces phytic acid content because soaking and fermentation activate enzymes, phytases, that break the phytate mineral bond. The practical fix is simple: prepare oats the night before rather than eating them dry or quick cooked in the same minute they're served. This single change, a matter of soaking time, not ingredient substitution, measurably improves how much of that bran's magnesium the body can actually use. An overnight soak of roughly 8 to 12 hours is the window most commonly referenced in food preparation research for meaningful phytase activation. Quick 10-minute soaks before cooking don't allow enough time for the enzymatic breakdown to occur. A small amount of acidity, a spoonful of yogurt, buttermilk, or a splash of lemon juice added to the soaking liquid, further supports phytase activity, which is part of why traditional overnight oats preparations across many food cultures historically included a fermented or acidic component rather than plain water. Mistake number 3. Taking morning medications at the same time as magnesium-rich foods. This mistake isn't about breakfast food itself, it's about what breakfast gets combined with. And it's arguably the most consequential item on this list for anyone over 60, because this is the age group most likely to be on daily medication. The research: 2 extremely common medication categories used heavily in this age group have well-documented magnesium interactions. Proton pump inhibitors, PPIs, used for acid reflux, are associated in multiple studies with reduced intestinal magnesium absorption over long-term use, to the point that regulatory drug safety agencies have issued specific warnings about hypomagnesemia risk with prolonged PPI use. Diuretics, especially loop and thiazide diuretics prescribed for blood pressure or heart failure, directly increase urinary magnesium excretion as part of how they function. Flushing sodium and water also flushes magnesium and potassium along with it. Research summarized in geriatric nutrition literature identifies diuretic use as one of the leading drug-related causes of magnesium depletion in older adults, specifically because this population is prescribed these medications at such high rates. The mistake at breakfast is twofold: taking these medications without any awareness of their mineral impact, and, just as importantly, not adjusting when magnesium-rich foods are eaten relative to the medication, since some absorption interactions are time-dependent. The right way and right timing. This is not a stop your medication message. These drugs are prescribed for serious reasons and should never be adjusted without a doctor's guidance. What the research does support is discussing magnesium status with a physician if you're on a PPI or diuretic long-term, since periodic blood testing can catch depletion before symptoms appear. Practically, taking medication with a full glass of water and a light meal, then spacing the day's largest magnesium-rich food intake to lunch or dinner rather than stacking everything into the same 15-minute breakfast window, is a reasonable, low-effort adjustment many clinicians recommend for mineral-sensitive medications. Regulatory drug safety reviews on long-term PPI use have specifically flagged that magnesium depletion tends to appear after roughly 1 year or longer of continuous use, which is exactly why this issue is so easy to miss. It doesn't show up in the first weeks of taking the medication, and by the time it's noticeable, deficiency may already be established. This is also why the general medical guidance for anyone on a PPI beyond the short term is periodic magnesium monitoring, not a one-time check at the start of treatment. Mistake number 2, salting breakfast heavily. Sodium and magnesium are linked through the same kidney mechanism that governs most mineral excretion. What pulls water out through the kidneys tends to pull magnesium out with it. The research, high sodium intake increases renal magnesium excretion through its effect on kidney filtration and reabsorption processes, a relationship established in renal physiology research on mineral handling. This matters at breakfast specifically because many better-for-you breakfast proteins, turkey bacon, breakfast sausage, deli-style ham, pre-seasoned egg products, are ultra-processed and carry substantial added sodium, often more preserving than people estimate, precisely because they're marketed as the lighter alternative to traditional bacon. The problem isn't that they're unhealthy in an obvious way, it's that their sodium load quietly drives magnesium excretion even while the product is marketed as a leaner, cleaner choice. For adults over 60, this is compounded by age-related declines in kidney efficiency, meaning the same sodium load produces a comparatively larger mineral excretion effect than it would in a younger kidney. The right way and right timing. Check sodium content on packaged breakfast meats rather than assuming turkey or chicken automatically means low sodium. Many processed versions carry 400 to 700 milligrams of sodium per serving, a substantial share of a daily target in one bite. Preparing eggs or unprocessed lean protein fresh, seasoned with herbs rather than salt-heavy pre-marinades, avoids the hidden sodium load. If a processed breakfast meat is part of the routine, pairing it with potassium-rich produce, like a banana, orange, or leafy greens, at the same meal helps counterbalance sodium's effect on the kidneys, since potassium supports more efficient magnesium retention through a related renal pathway. Timing plays a role here too. Eating the highest sodium item of the day at breakfast, rather than later, means the kidneys are managing that excretion load for the longest possible stretch before the next meal replenishes anything. Shifting the day's saltiest food to a later meal, when overall mineral intake for the day is already higher, is a small sequencing change that several renal nutrition guidelines for older adults specifically recommend. Mistake number 1. Treating alcohol from the night before as irrelevant to breakfast. This is the countdown's top spot because its effect is the largest, the most consistently documented, and the most commonly ignored, since the mistake technically happens the night before, but its consequences land squarely on the next morning's mineral status. The research, alcohol has one of the strongest documented effects on magnesium of anything on this list. It acts as a diuretic, increasing urinary magnesium loss, and chronic or even moderate to heavy intake is associated in clinical literature with magnesium depletion severe enough that hypomagnesemia is a recognized, well-studied finding in regular drinkers, to the point that magnesium status is a standard consideration in clinical management of alcohol-related health issues. Even outside of heavy or chronic use, a single evening of drinking increases overnight urinary magnesium loss measurably, meaning the breakfast mistake isn't anything eaten at the table. It's walking into breakfast already several steps behind on magnesium before a single bite is taken, then compounding that deficit with a coffee-first, low-magnesium meal. This is particularly relevant for adults over 60 attending brunch-style social occasions. Mimosas, wine with a weekend breakfast, where a beverage that seems occasional and celebratory carries the same physiological mineral excretion mechanism as any other alcohol intake. The right way and right timing. If alcohol is part of an evening, prioritizing hydration and a magnesium-containing food, nuts, seeds, leafy greens, legumes, either that evening or the following morning helps offset the overnight loss. Timing this replenishment within 12 to 24 hours rather than letting several days pass is the practical window supported by how quickly urinary magnesium excretion responds to intake changes. On mornings following any alcohol intake, breakfast is exactly the wrong time to also stack a caffeine-first, refined carb, high-sodium combination from the mistakes above. The cumulative excretion effect compounds rather than resetting. Clinical literature on alcohol and mineral status also notes that the excretion effect is dose-related and cumulative across a drinking occasion rather than triggered only past some heavy drinking threshold, meaning moderate intake still contributes to the same mechanism, just at a smaller scale. For adults over 60 who drink occasionally rather than daily, the practical takeaway isn't abstinence. It's simply not treating the following morning's breakfast as a mineral-neutral fresh start when the kidneys are still processing the excretion effects from the night before. The countdown recapped. 7. Coffee or tea before food. Caffeine raises urinary magnesium excretion by roughly 45% within 2 hours. Fix. Eat first, drink second with a 20 to 30 minute gap. 6. Stacking calcium and magnesium in one sitting. The two minerals compete for the same absorption pathway. Fix. Separate high-dose calcium from magnesium-rich foods by at least 2 hours. 5. Refined carbohydrate breakfasts. Up to 80% of a grain's magnesium is lost in refining, and the resulting glucose spike increases renal magnesium loss further. Fix. Choose intact whole grains and pair carbs with protein. 4. Unprepared bran or oats. Phytic acid binds magnesium and blocks absorption. Fix. Soak overnight, 8 to 12 hours, ideally with a splash of acidity. 3. Medication food timing blind spots. PPIs and diuretics are established, well-documented contributors to magnesium depletion in older adults. Fix. Discuss periodic magnesium testing with a physician. Don't stack medication and mineral-heavy food in the same instant without awareness. 2. High-sodium healthy breakfast meats. Sodium and magnesium share an excretion pathway through the kidneys. Fix. Check labels, favor fresh preparation, add potassium-rich produce. 1. Ignoring last night's alcohol, one of the most well-documented magnesium-depleting factors in clinical literature, with effects lasting into the next morning. Fix. Replenish with magnesium-rich food within 12 to 24 hours. Don't compound it with mistakes 7 through 2 the next day. The pattern underneath all 7. Look back across this list and a single theme repeats. None of these 7 mistakes are about eating something toxic. Every one of them involves something ordinary, often something marketed or perceived as the healthy choice. Black coffee, calcium for bone health, whole grain cereal, bran, prescribed medication, lean processed meat, a celebratory drink. That's precisely why this is called a silent drain. None of these habits produce an obvious warning sign at breakfast. The mechanism is cumulative. Small excretion increases, small absorption blocks, repeated daily, against a biological backdrop where absorption is already less efficient and excretion is already less well regulated than it was decades earlier. The research is consistent on the scale of the problem. Intake shortfalls affecting roughly half of older adults in national survey data, deficiency rates reaching 29% to over 50% in hospitalized and institutionalized elderly populations depending on the study, and a documented link between low magnesium status and both frailty risk and cognitive performance in adults over 60. None of the fixes above require dramatic changes. They require sequencing: food before caffeine, calcium separated from magnesium, medication timing discussed with a doctor, sodium balanced with potassium, and evening alcohol accounted for the next morning rather than ignored. Small adjustments, applied consistently, are what the research actually supports. Not a new supplement, not an extreme diet, just a smarter order of operations at the one meal most people run on autopilot. It's also worth sitting with why this particular meal carries so much weight. Breakfast is, for most people, the most routinized meal of the day, the one built on habit rather than conscious decision-making, repeated with almost identical structure hundreds of times a year. That repetition is exactly what makes small, invisible mineral losses add up into something measurable over months and years, and it's exactly why breakfast, more than lunch or dinner, is the meal where a handful of research-backed sequencing changes can compound into the biggest cumulative difference. None of these 7 items require giving anything up. They require putting the same foods, the same coffee, and the same medication in a slightly different order. This content is for general educational purposes based on published research and is not a substitute for personalized medical advice. Anyone managing a chronic condition, taking prescription medication, or concerned about their magnesium status should consult their physician before making significant dietary changes.